Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry podcast, episode 11, International Organizations, Part 1, the United Nations. I am your host, Adam Grange. I came back and edited in the new title I decided on after I realized I would need to do another episode on international organizations. So if there is some confusion caused by that in other parts I left in the episode, I am sorry. I am quite excited about this episode. I personally have never deep dove into international organizations, so there was a lot for me to learn about here, and I think this is a topic quite a few people will be interested in as well. I will probably mostly be referring to them as IGOs in this episode, which stands for Intergovernmental Organizations. They are also called this, but I personally prefer the term international organizations, but IGO is a bit easier to keep repeating. If you don't know what they are, you've most assuredly heard of several, like the United Nations, WHO, NATO. In this episode, we will be exploring pretty much all of the largest IGOs in the world, though. This, of course, includes the United Nations, or the UN, and its subsidiaries, which there are quite a lot of, the World Bank and its subsidiaries, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, the European Union, or the EU, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. There are probably some others that I'll mention, but these are probably the largest that most people have heard of. Also, discussing the United Nations is going to take quite some time, and even many of the larger organizations I listed above are a part of the UN, sort of. I'll explain that a bit further on. So I may have to split this episode into 2 episodes anyway. But we'll see how we go. I think the natural place to start is with the United Nations, as it is the largest international organization by quite a margin. A tad bit of history first, as I think most people have an idea of how and why the United Nations formed, but a refresher might help for some background. Usually, it seems history classes will start at the end of World War I and the formation of the League of Nations, which subsequently collapsed going into World War II, since major countries that comprised the League of Nations split into the Axis and Allied powers. Since the League of Nations failed to prevent another global conflict with the world powers, it altogether failed. That was the main purpose of the League of Nations. At the end of World War II, countries again decided it might be a good idea to try and avoid another immensely devastating conflict. And after some delegations and trial and error, the United Nations was formed through the UN Charter. By the remaining world powers, they signed the UN Charter, and that was in 1945. The history doesn't matter too much, since we want to analyze the United Nations as it is today, though. There are now 193 member states, which is almost every recognized country in the world. And there are also 2 observer states, which are the Holy See and Palestine. Since there has not been a World War III, it can be generally observed that the mission of world peace that the League of Nations failed at has been a success so far with the United Nations. I'm sure that statement will bring up some criticism, but no organization is without criticism, so we'll leave the anecdotes alone for now. It's more important to figure out what the United Nations actually does as a whole again today. And, well, they do a lot, and it certainly isn't realistic to try and sum it up in a few words. The best way, I think, to get a general grasp is to look at the structure. As the UN website itself states, the United Nations coordinates its work with the funds, programs, specialized agencies, and other organizations of the UN systems. Which is that's a quote from the UN website, and we'll be going over all of those, all the funds, the programs, well, not all of them, but most of them, the specialized agencies and the other organizations. So that will kind of be our structure here. And luckily for us, the United Nations does us the favor of breaking down their own structure. So there are 6 principal bodies, or as they call them, organs. So it's 6 principal organs. These are the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. I think these are all pretty apt names that describe what each organ oversees pretty well. Besides the Trusteeship Council, perhaps that one might be a bit confusing, but that's okay, because it is the only principal organ that has suspended operations. So because it is the simplest, we'll describe that one first. The Trusteeship Council oversaw the United Nations Trust Territories, which were non-self-governing territories. Essentially, the Council helped to guide countries toward independence, whether they were colonized or just non-self-governing in general. And as the last country designated as a trust territory by the UN became independent in 1994, that was the island nation of Palau, the Trusteeship Council stopped operations in 1994. It is still considered a principal organ, though. Now we'll go in order, starting with the main organ, the General Assembly. This organ focuses on representation. Global discussion is the key interaction here, as the General Assembly itself is a conference conducted annually. So if you look up the United Nations General Assembly, you'll get information on the conference itself, but they're also the principal organ that sets up the General Assembly is called the General Assembly. Today, the conference, the General Assembly, lasts for about 4 months-ish, from about the end of September to December, sometimes bleeding into January if all of the issues have not been discussed and decided on. And each member country is represented here, which, if you remember, is almost every globally recognized independent country. Each of the countries also gets one vote, which ensures equal representation regardless of size or power. There can also be special emergency sessions called. The General Assembly annual session serves as the representative policy-making area of the United Nations. The General Assembly also consists of several organizations you may have heard of. The UN refers to these organizations that exist under the umbrella of the General Assembly as subsidiary organs. These are split into 4 categories, the first being intergovernmental and expert bodies, the second is funds and programs, the third is research and training, and the fourth is just other entities. Under the intergovernmental and expert bodies, there is the Disarmament Commission, the Human Rights Council, the International Law Commission, and the International Trade Law Commission, among others. Hopefully these are all fairly self-explanatory. Now for perhaps my favorite section, the funds and programs. I'll go through the ones I think are the most important to talk about one by one. Here, perhaps my favorite subsidiary organ in general is the United Nations Development Program, or the UNDP, which I would have talked about this, or at least mentioned it, in a previous episode. This is the organ that creates the annual Human Development Report, so if you've listened to pretty much any other episode, I'm sure you can see why it's my favorite. I mentioned the HDI quite a bit. Anyway, these are released around the middle of the year each year, and give a very surprising amount of detail and insight into so many development factors that it can't really be understated how fascinating they are and how fascinating the whole report is. The Human Development Index itself is derived from the report, but as I've stated in the past, the index is a general look at development in 3 key categories. The Human Development Report itself goes over a vast array of other factors, to things even like how artificial intelligence is influencing development, which was a rather interesting read for the 2025 Human Development Report. I think it's a wonderful read to broaden perspective and gain insights into things that affect people around the world and the numbers on how they're affected. Because of this deep research, the UNDP focuses on development and poverty eradication, which is a major goal of the United Nations itself. This is aided by 2 funds under the UNDP, which focuses on aiding the least developed countries. The United Nations Capital Development Fund, or UNCDF, focuses on increasing capital to invest in high-risk markets in the poorest countries in the world. The United Nations Volunteers, or UNV, is exactly what it sounds like. There are over 150 countries that the volunteers are deployed to, but the major focus here is on development initiatives. The UN has a very tight budget, and not many major donor countries in general, so volunteer work is heavily relied on. This is something I plan to do in my own future, and so hopefully I'm still doing our podcast then, so I can talk about the experience. The United Nations Environment Program is the next subsidiary organ I'd like to talk about, and it's fairly self-explanatory. This one is also one that can be considered a program of the Secretariat, and there are a few of those, but the branches of the UN are closely tied together in general anyway. The main focuses here are on environmental protection, pollution, and sustainable development, which means they also work with the UNDP. An organ you may have heard of is UNICEF, which stands for the United Nations Children's Fund. UNICEF aims to save children from active threats and help develop children around the world by aiding with health, nutrition, clean water, sanitation, hygiene, vaccinations, and education, of course. This fund also helps the mothers of those children. The WFP stands for the World Food Program, and this helps specifically with food, of course, but especially in times of natural disaster or a conflict. Under research and training, I'll quickly discuss a couple of these. The United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or UNIDIR, studies various types of weaponry and how to better improve arms treaties. The United Nations University is literally a university funded by the United Nations. They teach students about issues various organs of the UN focus on, like sustainability, development, peace, etc. So, not quite like a general university one might attend, but a specialized version of higher education to teach students for the United Nations and the focuses it has. The other entities category is more of a grab bag of organs that don't fit into the other categories. Some of the organs here are the International Trade Center, or ITC, and UN Women, which specifically works to empower women around the world, especially through education. There are a bunch of other random offices, too, that deal with specific crises, like the Palestine crisis currently, and a lot of things with refugees and among other things like that. Our next principal organ is the Security Council, which is perhaps the next simplest to explain aside from the Trusteeship Council. This is the branch you may have heard the most controversy about, since there is a group of 5 countries that have the power of veto in the session, in the council sessions, which essentially means they are more powerful than all of the other countries represented, which goes against much of what the United Nations stands for and what the General Assembly stands for. They are referred to as P5 and are the United States, the United Kingdom, China, France, and Russia. The fact that they have the power of veto means any one of these countries can block any substantial resolution, or any resolution in general, even if every single other country, including the other countries that have the veto power, vote for the resolution passing. This, of course, generates issues, but for example of why this even exists, the United States would not even join the United Nations if it wasn't granted the power of the veto, and the UN kind of needed the US's money, as will become clear a little later on. If you also noticed, these 5 countries are generally considered to be the world's biggest powers, and have the largest and most effective militaries worldwide. In matters of things like development, it makes more sense to grant equal power to the United States, one of the world's largest and the world's richest country, and parenthetically generally considered to have the world's strongest military. And then Palau, a small island nation that recently became independent. But in matters of security and military, it's a bit more difficult to justify Palau with no active military as having exactly equal power as the United States, which Palau is reliant on for protection. There are, of course, a lot of caveats there and plenty of political discussion, and I'll discuss more of what this kind of means for the United Nations near the end of the episode, because it's important to focus on what the United Nations itself is, and it is not a world police force or something like that. So again, there's plenty of political discussion there, but we're not a political podcast, so we won't get into that. We'll get into what the Security Council itself actually does. The Counterterrorism Committee, of course, focuses on countering terrorism. This already gets a bit political, though, because terrorist attacks can be considered as such by some nations and by others as not terrorism at all, as has been the case in the past. But that's why the Security Council exists, is to vote on things like that so the trends of support to one side or another can be put into plain view. The main focus of the Security Council, however, is its peacekeeping missions. Another source of controversy, since the word peacekeeping doesn't seem to explain these missions very well. Unfortunately, though, the reality of keeping peace in an active war zone is military retaliation, and much of what the peacekeeping missions does is exactly that. However, at least on paper, the goals of the blue helmets, which you may have seen, people wearing a blue helmet with the white UN on it, it's what the peacekeepers are referred to as colloquially. The goals are to protect and evacuate civilians and monitor ceasefires. They aim to act as an unbiased third party with military power in a conflict. One of the major interorganizational committees of the United Nations exists between the General Assembly and the Security Council. This is the Peace Building Commission. This is differentiated from peacekeeping in that the goal is to help a country move on after conflict has been resolved and help rebuilding and sustaining lasting peace. This may still require peacekeepers on deck to maintain peace in case of insurgency or to continue monitoring ceasefires, as I said before, but it involves the General Assembly too, because a big focus of rebuilding is development, and that also requires a significant amount of money, which the Security Council does not have. Although, another caveat there, the general funding is, the funding in the UN is pretty complicated. I'll try and sum it up into a sort of a segue into ECOSOC, because there's a pretty big funding problem with the UN. The UN regular budget is the budget that you'll see if you look up the UN budget or something like that. It's the annual budget for all of the regular United Nations activities. If a project or a committee requires additional funding, it is up to them to find it. For a country to remain a member of the United Nations, their contribution to the regular budget must be 0.01% of the total budget, which is not very much. As of the year of recording this, 2025, not every country has paid their portion of the UN regular budget, which is a normal thing, and they all have until February of the following year to pay. So because trends have not changed, let's look at the previous year, since it will also be the same for many previous years and probably many years to come. If you could have guessed, the United States is the largest contributor to the United Nations regular budget. About 22% of the budget is paid by the United States, with China following at about 15%. The next three largest are Japan at 8%, Germany at 6%, and the UK at a little over 4%. Most other rich countries contribute about 1 to 2%, while the rest of the member states combined are around 11%. However, I mentioned other funding needs to be created outside of the regular required budget if it is needed. The largest total fund for any UN activity is not the regular budget, which last year was $3.59 billion. It is the Peacekeeping Fund, which again is not required, but had a budget of $5.59 billion last year. So I said earlier that part of the reason the Security Council works with the General Assembly is because they require a significant amount of money, and the Security Council does not have it, which is true in a sense because the Security Council doesn't have a budget for itself, but there is a budget for peacekeeping missions specifically, and that one is $2 billion more than the total budget for the UN itself. So, again, like I said, caveats there, and that's sort of what sparks, in my opinion at least, from my observations, controversy on things especially like the Security Council and the peacekeeping missions. Anyway, the usual countries that I stated before for the regular budget remain in the trend for the peacekeeping fund, but the U.S. and China are a bit higher with about 27% and 18% respectively. Anyway, you can draw your own conclusions from that information, but it's important to know the structure and the trends of the budget regardless. I mentioned before that little discussion, a thing called ECOSOC, which perhaps you've heard of before. This is the shortened name the abbreviation given to the third principal organ of the UN, the Economic and Social Council. ECOSOC, like the General Assembly, has subsidiary organs broken into 4 categories. Those are functional commissions, which are generalized commissions for around the world, regional commissions, which are more specialized agencies to certain areas of the world, other bodies, which is the grab bag again, and then research and training, which only has 2 subsidiary organs, and they mostly focus on research for social issues. By my guess, there is only perhaps 1 subsidiary organ out of all of these categories, which some of you may have heard of. So I'll just quickly list some others because the names can give us an idea of what it is actually meant by the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. Under functional commissions, we have crime prevention, narcotic drugs, social development, the status of women. These are commissions that focus on helping with social issues that affect economies around the world, just in general. Under regional commissions, we have 5 abbreviated commissions that all start with Economic Commission, and each of the 5 focus on a gross region of the world. Those 5 would be Africa, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific, and Western Asia. Notably, there aren't specialized economic commissions for most of the developed and rich parts of the world, like North America and Western Europe. Interestingly, as well, under other bodies is the Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations, or NGOs, the focus of our episode today. Since the UN is so large, there are many other NGOs that are a part of it, but they're still separate from the UN, or they work with the UN. So there must be a committee that oversees this aspect. They do things like handle applications for NGOs that wish to work with ECOSOC and monitor NGOs that are already a partner. Now, the one I thought that we may have heard of before is UNAIDS, which is the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. This was something that was popping up in the news and social media quite a bit several years ago, and their focus is mostly on sub-Saharan Africa, where the HIV and AIDS epidemic is the most severe. The final category, research and training, contains the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and since that is quite the mouthful, they have given us a handy abbreviation, UNICRI. This institution doesn't work on actually preventing crime and upholding the rule of law, but focuses on researching how to better prevent crime and apply that research into training. The other subsidiary organ here is the United Nations Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD. Some of these abbreviations you can say as a word, and some of them are, UNRISD isn't that could maybe be a term in modern slang, but anyway, the focus is to study inequality, poverty, social protection, labor markets, gender equality, social policy, things like that, and again, provide training on the research conducted. Our next principal organ is the Secretariat, which is our last sort of juicy organ. Since NGOs have a lot in common with governments, although they are not governments, notably, the UN Charter figured it would be a good idea to divide power. You can think of the General Assembly as a legislative branch that focuses on voting on things, and you can think of the Secretariat as the administrative, executive branch that implements decisions made by other branches, mostly the General Assembly. Our next and final principal organ after the Secretariat is, perhaps ostensibly, the International Court of Justice. So the Secretariat itself sort of does the daily tasks, in a sense. They manage offices and departments and worldwide field missions, a lot of management stuff. They handle the administration, budgeting, logistics, so, the office work, sort of. And of course, then the Secretariat is split up into various departments and offices. There is the highest office, which is the Executive Office of the Secretary General, who currently is Antonio Guterres of Portugal. This does not quite function like a president or a prime minister or something, but it can be somewhat easier to relate the two. The Secretary General doesn't have term limits, as it is completely discretionary due to the UN Charter, but for most of the history of the UN, each have served 5-year terms, with one exception of one Secretary General serving 2 5-year terms. The Secretary General is decided on by the General Assembly, but the recommendation comes from the Security Council. Most Secretary Generals also have no real prior fame and are just kind of regular people that work within the UN. Most also come from what are known as middle power countries, which have worldwide influence but are not a superpower country like the US or China, or even a great power like the UK or Germany or Japan. The Security Council does popular votes, like straw polls is the most common one, and then submits the winner to the General Assembly, who then approve or deny the candidate. Although no candidate has been denied since 1950, and there was only one denial happening ever. They act as the top diplomats and the physical leader of the United Nations. There are also 29 other major offices of the Secretariat. So I'll list some, since the names of the offices describe what resolutions the offices carry out, whether it be from the General Assembly, the Security Council, or ECOSOC. I'll start in no particular order of importance with the offices that deal with the General Assembly most closely. The Development Coordination Office, or DCO, the Department for General Assembly and Conference Management, or DGACM, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, the United Nations Youth Office, or UN Youth. There are also other offices for 3 other headquarters around the world, in Geneva, Switzerland, in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Vienna, Austria. These are abbreviated as UNOG, UNON, and UNOV, respectively. The main headquarters is in New York City, where the office of the Secretary General is, and it's sort of the centerpiece of the whole headquarters. There is also a specialized office in The Hague, Netherlands, but as far as I'm aware, it isn't an official office of the Secretariat. I believe they only do International Court of Justice activities, and I'll confirm that later once we get to my section of notes on that. Anyway, some of the offices that work closely with the Security Council are the Department of Safety and Security, or DSS, Department of Peace Operations, or DPO, the Office of Counterterrorism, or OTT, and the Office for Disarmament Affairs, or ODA. There are also 3 offices for special representatives of the Secretary General that work with the Security Council that are double abbreviated. They all stand as SRSG for Special Representative of the Secretary General, and the 3 separate offices are for Children and Armed Conflict, or CAAC, on Sexual Violence in Conflict, or SVC, and on Violence Against Children, or VAC. Some of the offices that work closely with ECOSOC are the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC, however you want to say it. There are also some offices that work with the International Court of Justice, like the Office of Legal Affairs, or OLA, but the International Court of Justice itself is the final principal organ and serves as the judicial branch, as I said earlier. This is mainly what the UN offices in The Hague exist for, as I also stated earlier, so that is confirmed. Abbreviated as IJC, it settles legal disputes between states, unlike how judicial systems within a country work, because they only deal with people or companies or things like that. So it's legal disputes between states. Some of these issues are things like border disputes, maritime boundaries, interpretations of treaties, various uses of force. All of the judgments are binding on the parties involved, since the parties involved are member states of the United Nations. However, the consequences of not following a judgment can't be enforced by the ICJ itself, because it has no military or police force. Mostly, non-compliance with a judgment can result in political pressure, things like sanctions, damaging the country's credibility, so it is within the best interest of each member state to comply. The IJC also gives advice to the other principal organs on legal matters not taken to court. The judges are also completely independent and do not represent a country, and they are elected every 9 years, so it's not a life term, and there is a rotation of 15 judges. Now, with the principal organs explained, we can talk about the related organizations and specialized agencies that are not a part of any of the principal organs. These are generally major NGOs or other agencies that sit outside the UN structure, but still work with or are even a part of the UN. I'll start with the related organizations, and most of these I will just list, as some I don't think are super important to explain, and some will be saved for later once we are done discussing the UN. But some of these I think should be discussed here. I'll start with the International Criminal Court, or ICC, since we're hot off discussing the ICJ. The key distinctions between the ICC and the ICJ are that the ICC is an independent court. It's not an organ of the UN. The ICC also prosecutes individuals instead of countries. These individuals can be heads of state or military commanders or something like that. Anyone can be tried for one or more of the 4 core crimes that the ICC prosecutes for. These crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, like enslavement, war crimes, like using child soldiers, and crimes of aggression, which are like invasions of one country into another. The ICC is a last resort when national courts fail to or won't prosecute responsible parties. However, since it is an independent court, UN member states are not required to be a member of the ICC. Some major countries that are not members are the United States, China, and Russia. This means, according to the Rome Statute that formed the ICC, that crimes committed in the territory of a country that is not a member of the ICC cannot be tried in the ICC. Part of the reason that it exists and that it works with the UN, however, is because the UN Security Council can refer a case to the ICC if it is deemed severe enough. Although just like the ICJ, the ICC has no way of enforcing judgments it passes, so enforcement relies on state cooperation. Another independent judicial court is the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLAS. It was established by the UN through the UNCLOS Treaty, which stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This also means, like with the ICC though, that even though judgments are legally binding, they rely entirely on cooperation from the states in a case. ITLAS handles conflicts with maritime boundaries, sea navigation rights, fishing rights, and marine environmental protection. There are a couple related organizations that deal with weaponry, these being the CTBTO Preparatory Commission and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. The former deals with the treaty that bans nuclear weapons testing, and the latter deals with ensuring chemical weapons aren't used in armed conflicts. There is also the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, and the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, which helps to ensure the resources on the bed of the oceans are used for the benefit of all humanity. And it was also established under UNCLOS, like ITLOS. The final major related organization is the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which, looking at our current runtime, will probably be saved for next episode, and I do want to link the discussion, I think, on that one anyway. Now we'll discuss the specialized agencies, which, according to the UN, are independent agencies that have been brought into a relationship with the UN through relationship agreements. I'll follow the same structure as I did discussing the related organizations, where I'll discuss the more important ones, list the rest, and then save the major ones for later. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, is similar to the World Food Program under the General Assembly, but works more towards building sustainability instead of short-term feeding solutions. FAO works to eradicate hunger and promote food security, which means physical, social, and economic access to food nutritious enough to meet dietary needs. This was a definition established at the 1996 World Food Summit, and I, for one, certainly wish it was a bit more clear. I think maybe a better colloquial definition would be access to enough food that helps satisfy human dietary needs, and continued access of that. Anyway, FAO also works to promote sustainable agriculture, fishing, and forestry. And if you recall way back in episodes 1 and 2, the poorest regions of the world struggle the most with sustainability. Another specialized agency that works closely with FAO is the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD. The next agency I'll discuss is UN Tourism, which I have no idea why it is abbreviated as such, because the actual name of the agency is the World Tourism Organization. You also may be thinking this is kind of a strange, major specialized agency, but that's why I thought it might be interesting to discuss instead of just list. UN Tourism sees global tourism as extremely important because it is a major source of jobs, investment, and foreign exchange. Think about places like Greece that heavily rely on tourism and how important the economic impact of tourism is on its development. Greece would probably be closer in development levels to the rest of the surrounding Balkan states in Eastern Europe instead of where it is today, which is closer to Western European levels of development without its levels of tourism. UN Tourism also sees foreign exchange as a major reason to support tourism. As I just said, it helps with cultural understanding and experience. UN Tourism is also heavily concerned with sustainable tourism, which may seem like a strange concept since we normally apply that term to something easily disappearing like agriculture or fishing. The core desire, though, with this is to have tourism benefit the host countries instead of having tourists ruin heritage sites or leave trash everywhere or something. The next one I'd like to discuss is one we probably don't think about too much as even existing. I know I don't, but the importance of it can't really be ignored. The Universal Postal Union is the specialized agency that coordinates deliveries between international postal services. Have you ever wondered, how a package ordered out of your country in a separate country gets to you? That's the UPU. They work with postal services in member countries of the UN to facilitate smooth transportation and delivery of individual parcels ordered by individuals from different countries than the origin country. Essentially, they enable worldwide mail delivery, or at least make it efficient enough to actually make sense. It's cheap enough. You need to send a letter to your friend who's visiting China. The UPU lets that happen. Want to order a piece of clothing from Sweden? The UPU helps the package get to your door. They achieve this by establishing international rules that deal with fair postal pricing, mail exchange, parcel delivery, and by creating a single international postal territory so letters and packages can be transported through standardized procedures. Personally, I think it's very cool, and it's certainly overlooked. Some of the others that I'll just list include the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, the International Labor Organization, or ILO, the International Maritime Organization, that works closely with ITLAS and UNCLOS, the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, and the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO. Some of these I think we don't really think of as existing, but serve important purposes in our modern world. One that's especially important for us is the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, or UNIDO, which quite predictably helps developing and underdeveloped countries build industrial capital and support manufacturing and industrial growth. I may bring them up in the future, but UNIDO is a comparatively simple agency, at least compared to the other agencies I will get into in the next episode now, which include the World Bank, the IMF, and UNESCO. The final one I'll discuss is the World Health Organization, or WHO. I am assuming this is one of the more well-known or more heard-of agencies, and it is indeed a specialized agency of the UN. WHO sets the global health standards on... Well, that sounds a little weird, doesn't it? The agency sets global health standards on things like disease treatments, vaccination schedules, and even nutrition. They also set norms for medical practices worldwide. These are not enforced by any means, except within the WHO itself. And now when I say the WHO, instead of just WHO, it makes me think of the band. But I suppose it is proper grammar. Anyway, the WHO also leads global responses to emergencies and outbreaks, and helps to support other countries' healthcare systems. And what the WHO is probably most well known for is the prevention and control of diseases. This includes infectious and non-communicable diseases, like malaria and diabetes, respectively, which the latter is where, their health standards on, nutrition would come in. Their operations are widespread and complex, but what the WHO focuses on is fairly simple, and like I said, it is the aspects of public health that are deemed to be what humans deserve worldwide. As I think we are running too long to get into anything brand new outside of the United Nations, like I said, I think I'm just going to do a full new episode, part 2. I'll cap off this episode by discussing the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, or HLPF. I left this until the end because even though it encompasses parts of the General Assembly and ECOSOC, it also introduces a new concept that's quite important to understand, to understanding the United Nations. I may have mentioned these in a previous episode, but we're going to go in depth into them now. They are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The purpose of the HLPF is to review and guide progress on the SDGs for 2030, which are the ones currently in effect. There are 2 other committees that work with the SDGs as well, the Division for Sustainable Development Goals and the Department of Social and Economic Affairs. There is also a separate development report for them specifically, the Sustainable Development Goals report. So, what are the SDGs then? They are a group of 17 specific goals designed to end poverty, protect the environment, and create peace, which, in a nutshell, is the main reason why the United Nations exists. Reasons, I suppose. These are ambitious goals that are designed to leave no one out, whether it be a developed, developing, or underdeveloped country. Each of the goals also has targets to reach so that the progress of specific countries can be tracked. Since there are 17, it's rather difficult to know all of them, but I'll list them anyway, as there are some more obvious and some more simple ones. And then I'll sort of do a little explanation on each of them. So here they are. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, that's 1, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, that's also 1, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible production and consumption, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and finally, partnerships for the goals. No poverty is just ending poverty in any and all forms everywhere. Zero hunger is based on food security that we discussed earlier and promoting sustainable agriculture to achieve zero hunger. Good health and well-being is one of the 3 dimensions of the Human Development Index, and it just means healthy and long lives for all. Quality education is another dimension of the Human Development Index and is defined to be of quality when it is equitable and inclusive and the teachers are well trained for their position, and the learning outcomes involve things like literacy, numeracy, critical thinking skills, problem solving. Gender equality is simply helping achieve equality for women and girls in things like education, human rights, etc. clean water and sanitation is pretty self-explanatory, but the key here is sustainability of clean water. Affordable and clean energy is an interesting one, and we will certainly be diving into empirical evidence for what clean energy really is in our far in the future planned series on energy, which I'm quite excited for, but we have a lot of build up to that, I think. Decent work and economic growth. Well, economic growth would be something we should be aware of if you have listened to episode 7, so I will refer you to that. But the UN describes decent work as fair income, safe working conditions, and as being secure. So a lot about security here, too. What that fair income is, however, is very difficult to define. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure are really based in improving higher sectors of industry, like the tertiary and the quaternary. Reduced inequalities is also an interesting one, but one I think is a bit more realistic because it is recognized inequality will always exist in human society, but that reduction of it is definitely achievable. Although that is perhaps a controversial take, there is plenty of empirical evidence that should suggest otherwise in research fields in economics and socioeconomics, in proving that reduced inequalities is achievable. And the UN does a lot of research on that itself. Anyway, I won't be discussing that here, so don't just take my word for it and research it on your own as well. Sustainable cities and communities can probably be best understood from how the UN defines a sustainable city, which includes equal access to housing, services, education, healthcare, and employment, while being safe, resilient to natural disasters, and helping to reduce the overall effect of anthropogenic global warming. Sorry, I tried to say that too fast. Responsible production and consumption also fits well with that definition. And also climate action works well with that definition. Life below water and life on land are said to conserve and protect marine and land ecosystems. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Well, I feel like this is a bit of a grab bag, but to better understand institutions, at least, and the effect they have when they are strong, I would refer you to episode 8 on theories of development. Just to know for here that strong institutions are a core reason for economic and human development. And finally, partnerships for the goals are meant to strengthen global cooperation to allow for the achieving of the other 16 goals. And again, having a general idea of the SDGs will help to have a grasp of what the UN does in general, and they're also good to know for knowing how development works. I'm also going to discuss the success of the UN quickly. It would be quite too much to list the successes and failures of everything we've gone over so far, so I'll just focus on the UN as a whole. Generally, it is thought that the initial goal of the UN, that is to prevent another large-scale global conflict like World War II, has generally been a success, as there has not been a World War III or something similar. It is also generally thought that the development standards that the UN puts forth and continues to revise based on new evidence has an impact on poverty reduction and increasing health, education, and food security, among other things. The UN is also seen at the forefront of generating global cooperation on issues like anthropogenic global warming, public health, and other things like telecommunications, which is quite important today. However, one of the more controversial aspects of the UN is the Security Council and their peacekeeping missions that I mentioned when we were talking about them. While there have been successes in helping end civil wars and other types of conflict, it has been mainly criticized for failing to stop genocides and ethnic cleansings, really large-scale atrocities, like the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The main criticisms with this event in particular is that the UN already had a peacekeeping mission stationed there in Rwanda to monitor the situation because the UN sort of knew what was going on, and still delayed recognizing it as a genocide long after the violence had escalated. Another criticism that I personally think isn't something necessarily to criticize is the fact that almost all resolutions rely on voluntary cooperation. There are only realistically two options here, and that is forced cooperation and voluntary cooperation, and I think voluntary is the way to go, but that is a personal opinion. The UN could certainly improve on its pressure creation and finding new ways of generating consequences when cooperation fails, but the way it is now is generally better, again, in my opinion, than forced military coercion. As I mentioned way earlier, a major criticism is the power structure around the Security Council, mostly with the allowance of the power of the veto to the P5. The budgeting issue remains a criticism as well, with no real forced taxation, since the required amount to remain a member state is basically insignificant, especially when there's only a handful of countries supporting the great majority of the budgets and funds. Also, the UN is criticized for excessive bureaucracy, which results in inefficiency and slow decision making, which is perhaps a root cause for the response on the Rwandan genocide. However, I believe there is a large misunderstanding on what the UN actually is and what the UN actually does. And I hope the information here sort of clears that up. The UN is not a government of governments or a world police force, which, when you look at the majority of the criticisms, that is where they stem from. The UN is a vast forum. That's the key word here, is forum. It's an international one where nations can congregate and discuss issues. It is not inherently a problem-solving entity, which is what it is believed to be. And yes, it does have ways of solving issues, and a lot of what we discussed is how the UN has figured out, how to help with solving issues, but that again relies on the cooperation of states. The UN just facilitates that cooperation by funding a method of discussing the issues that should be solved worldwide. And then they provide agencies that can facilitate solving those issues, again, with state cooperation. This is not a, solve-all for all the criticisms and issues the UN has and generates, but it is good to be better educated on what the UN actually is before engaging in argument about it. The main thing to remember is that the UN has no power itself. It has zero power. The nations that are members of the UN hold all the power. Anyway, I guess the United Nations did take up a whole episode. So in the next episode, we will finish our discussion on NGOs by actually talking about some different NGOs. Jokes aside, the various parts, agencies, committees, and offices we discussed in this episode also fit into the category of international organizations. But next episode, we will talk about the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and UNESCO that I mentioned earlier, as well as some prominent economic and military agreements, and some other things. Hopefully, we'll see how that episode goes too. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, though, and if you'd like to offer advice or suggestions or just want to say hi, the show's email is open at fabricofindustry@gmail.com. You can also visit our Facebook page and give us a like, or join our Discord from there. And I would greatly appreciate a positive review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts, as it's a great way to get more people listening. And with that, I'll talk to you next time.